Hello students, welcome back to the another video section of data communication and computer network. Today we will discuss about or learn about the communication between layers. The second unit of data communication and computer network starts with layering protocol, or you can say protocol layers. As you know that in OSI model there are 7 layers and each and every layer having its own functions to coordinate with other layers. So today's section is all about how the subsequent particular layers in a subsequent model or network model can communicate with each other. So as you know that there are 7 layers in OSI model. So in the network layer architecture, when one layer requires another layer to carry out a service, the communication between the layers is carried out by service primitives. In this case, primitives are nothing. These are basically called the commands which can functioning, or the commands which is normally assigned to for a specific task between one layer to another layer when more than one layer communicate with each other. A service is formally specified by a set of primitives, that is also known as operations, available to a user or other entity in the network or other entities in the network layer to access the service. First of all, in OSI model, there are certain layers are there, or there are 7 layers are there. Each and every layer having its own like operations or own assignments. So every individual layer should provide a subsequent like function or subsequent particularly procedure to communicate with each other or to communicate with upper or its lower level layers. So that's why basically the service which is related with communicate between one layer to another layer, or the operation which are normally communicate with one layer to another layer are basically called primitives. These primitives tell the service to perform some action or report on an action taken by the peer entity. So in this case, you know that there are two subsequent particularly systems are interconnected with each other. As I said earlier, one thing is called P2P network, another thing is called client server architecture or client server network. So when a particularly node communicates with other nodes, so this is basically called PIP or individual concept. So that's why the primitives which is basically tells the service to perform some action or report on an action taken by the subsequent peer entity. So that's why the service primitive is an abstract representation of the interaction between a service provider and a service user. As you know that one particular person or one subsequent particularly terminal or entity or node are normally treated as transmitter, another is called basically receiver. So one particularly peer entity, or you can say the node, are normally in this case is normally called like service provider, and another is normally called the user of the subsequent service. So basically the service primitives, or the service operations are normally like an abstract representation of the interaction between two subsequents and the service provider and as well as the service use. So that's why the service primitives are concerned with what interaction take place rather than how such interaction are implemented. So what type of you can say what type of interaction can be take place between one entity to another entity or one node to another node, that should be actually concerned, or that should be normally like the task of the subsequent particular service primitives. So basically in this section, what is service primitive and so on the thing. So that's why just particular certain points are there. In layer protocol, a layer is a service protocol and may consist of several service functions. As you know that basically each and every layer in a OSI model having its own type of own protocol, and there are certain protocols are widely implemented for communicating like the data or like message or information from one layer to another layer. So the basic idea of the layer to add a value between the layers in the subsequent network. So each and every layer should communicate with each other for the smooth run of the communication, or you can say the communication of data. The topmost layer or the top layer which interfaces directly with the end user, that is application is provided with the full range of services offered by all the lower layers. As you know that the topmost layer is basically called the application layer, and the bottommost layer, or we can say another layer, the last layer is called physical layer. And physical layer is directly connecting with the subsequent communication medium, and the application layer is directly connecting with the end user, that is the user can interact directly with the application layer, and the physical layer are physically connected the medium which is communicated between one node to another node in the OSI model. So the actual services invoked are directly by the upper layer to the lower layer. So it is normally called a particularly like a sequence, that is sequence of particular communication or data communication. It starts from upper layer to the subsequent lower layer. So it is normally in a step-by-step process while actually communicating data from one node to another. And next some points are there, like each protocol which communicate in the layer architecture, that is based on OSI model or TCP/IP model or reference model, anything else, communicates in a peer-to-peer manner with its remote protocol entity. So basically one node can communicate with another node like in a peer-to-peer particularly model or manner in OSI reference model. So that's why each and every protocol which is normally available in the different layers of the OSI reference model are normally basically called communicate between one node to another node. So communication between the adjoint protocol layer. So every individual layer having a step-by-step procedure. The adjoint particular protocol layer, that is within the same communication node. So one node having 7 layers, like that is in OSI reference model, and another node also having 7 layers in the OSI reference model. So that's why communication layers between nearby particular protocol layers, like the related or the next particular protocol layers, are managed by calling functions called primitives. As I said earlier, the operation or the subsequent communication for the operation is basically called primitives, and this particularly like the primitives are managed by calling the functions between the subsequent layer. So as I said earlier, every individual layer in the OSI reference model having its own subsequent particularly functionality or some task which is pre-assigned. So there are various types of actions that may be performed by the primitive. So basically like simple communication, जब हम लोग एक दूसरे से बात करते हैं तो सबसे पहले हम लोग एक पर्टिकुलरली रिक्वेस्ट सेंड करते हैं. रिक्वेस्ट का सब्सिक्वेंस पर्टिकुलर सबसे पहले वो इंडिकेशन प्रोवाइड करता है. इंडिकेशंस के बाद वो रेस्पॉन्स प्रोवाइड करता है एंड रेस्पॉन्स के बाद वो कंफर्मेशंस प्रोवाइड करता है. सो देयर आर several actually you can say primitives there, or various types of primitives or actions there in a subsequent particular layer model or layer protocol concepts. So that's it. And also this particular OSI reference model also having the various types of actions that may perform by the primitive. So primitive is normally called operation or commands which normally carry out the subsequent communication between one layer to another layer. So this is basically called a block diagram or a diagram for service primitive. So before starting, what is service primitive? So service primitive is basically these are basically service primitives are concerned with what interaction take place rather than how such interaction are implemented. So it is basically called the commands which can be or operations or which can be certain functions, like inbuilt functions are there which can be communicated between layer to layer. So in this particular diagram, it having two subsequence nodes, that is A and B, and A having normally directly communicate with SAP, that is service access point, and normally service access point, that particular first is normally called the event one, and event one is basically called in this case that is called request, and like node A or B A normally sends a request to the subsequence, particularly service access point, and access point normally is on the side of like A, it normally communicate with the SAP, that is service access point of the B, and it normally like provides the indication, that is normally called the like event 2, and after that it can actually provide the response. Then after the response is normally basically called the event 3, and by the help of the service access point, it again return to the subsequent particular node called A, and that is called the confirmation. So basically अगर इस चीज को हम लोग देखेंगे in the above particular diagram, so in the diagram the particular the using of 4 transactions are called primitives. So there are 4 subsequent transactions there in the subsequence model or in the subsequence diagram, that is request, indication, response, and as well as confirmation. So that's why basically request, indication, like you can say response and confirmation, there are 4 subsequent particular primitives are widely implemented for like communicating the data. The primitives are invoked, and from the layer to the identifier is called service access point. So that SAP, that is called service access point, is nothing. The primitives are invoked when the like you can say the primitives or the operations or the commands are invoked to and from the layer, because both the subsequence particularly end, that is A and B, having its own particular primitives. So the particular the primitives are invoked, the primitive which are invoked to and from the layer through the identifier, that particular thing is basically called SAP, that is called service access point. Here the service access point or the service access like provider, like the service provider is also used which provides different type of service and as well as a function to the subsequent user. So in this particular diagram, like first of all, A send the request to the like B, that is user A sends the request to the user B to the service provider, because as I said earlier, one thing is called service provider, another thing is called service user. So there are two subsequence, and so right now A is basically called the service provider and B is basically called the service user. So that's why the first of all, like the user A or the system A like sends the request to the user B through the service provider, like by the use of certain functions. Then the another service provider must send an indication to B. So the indication should be, the request should be converting into the indication. So indication again provided by the service provider to the subsequent B. So after this indication, B is required to provide a response, because जब भी मैं मान लो जैसे कि कोई क्वेरीज अगर कर रहा हूँ या क्वेश्चंस वगैरह पूछ रहा हूँ, तो जब मैं क्वेरी कर रहा हूँ तो उसका रेस्पॉन्स होना चाहिए, either it may be yes or no. If you know that particular query, तो अगर उसका आंसर आपको पता है तो आप उसको प्रॉपर्ली डिस्क्राइब कर सकते हो, अगर नहीं है तो आप स्ट्रेट से बोल सकते हो जैसे कि मेरे को नहीं पता है. सो दैट्स व्हाई आफ्टर दिस पर्टिकुलर इंडिकेशन, जब इंडिकेशन प्रोवाइड किया जाता है, B is required to provide a response. Then the service provider provide a function confirm to the subsequent user A. So the confirmation should be there, like after response in that particular thing. So there are two subsequents particularly like pairs there. Like one thing is called request with indication, another thing is called response with confirmation. So that's why After doing that subsequent things, the difference between the subsequent thing, like request should be like passed from the user A and indication by the help of service provider, and by the help of certain service access point, it directly go to the B, and B is another user which normally again service provider normally provides an indication to that. After getting the indication, it normally the service the user B like send the response to the subsequent particular service provider by the help of SAP, that is service access point, and after that the A normally receives the confirmation about that. And the second diagram also defined like that. The A normally passes the request, and subsequently like B normally pulls the indication, and after that by the help of the indication it normally provides the response to the subsequent user A, and A normally confirm about the subsequent state. So basically this particular diagram or the both the diagram says that there are subsequent 4 primitives or service primitives are there: request, indication, response, and as well as confirmation. So by the help of that particular thing, let's say here there are 4 type of primitives used for communicating data between one layer to another layer in the OSI reference model, and the basic 4 types are request, service, indication, and as well as request, indication, like response and confirmation. So first of all, we just focus about the request primitive. So this is issued by the service user to the service provider to request the invocation of a procedure, that is called function. So it can be the request should be passed from the service user to the service provider. And second, indication primitive normally says that this is issued by the service provider, because the indication overall issued by the service provider to the peer service user, that is the user, in this case A and B, usually in response to the request primitive. After sending the request primitive, the indication primitive should be provided by the service provider to indicate that the procedure or the function has to be request. And the third subsequence primitive is basically called response primitive. And response primitive, this particular thing is issued by the field service user, that is the individual service user, to the service provider, usually in response and indication primitive. So it is for that indication primitive. After receiving the indication primitive, the service user or field service user normally issued a subsequent response to the subsequent service provider. So that's why to indicate, this particular thing is to indicate that the request procedure has been invoked. So request has been sent, and it is normally invoked by the service provider. And the fourth is normally called the confirm primitive, and this is issued by the service provider to a service user to indicate that the earliest request, before the request should be passed, first of all, the earliest request for the invocation or the communication of a procedure has been completed. So basically every individual query having a particularly like answer, so every question having answer. So in this manner, if a particularly user send a particular request, अगर एक user जैसे कि in this case A अगर एक request भेज रहा है B को, तो B उसको सबसे पहले by the help of the service provider which should provide the indication, से indication ये कर रहा है जैसे कि आपका एक request आया है so and so node से, and after actually receiving or after normally like issued the indication, the service particular provider normally issues or normally provides a response to the subsequent request, and after that the response should be reached from the reached in the side of request. So request को पता चल जाएगा या उस particular service user को पता चल जाएगा, this is basically my request is confirmed or my request is completed. That's why the acknowledgement should be there in the particular user. So basically these are the 4 particular things of the subsequent like primitive, that is for the service provider primitive. So that's why to send data, the sender invokes a data. So in this case अगर आपका कोई data send हो रहा है, कोई भी particular request आप भेज रहे हो, तो उसके बदले में आपको उसका response चाहिए 100%. So to send the data, the sender invokes a data request specifying a packet That is, you can say the frame of packets or the subsequence, like you can say data frames to packet to be sent. So as you know that in the previous section also we discussed about that, अगर हम लोग कोई मैसेज भेज रहे हैं तो उसको पैकेट कंसेप्ट में डिवाइड कर रहे हैं, और पैकेट में हमेशा आपका नॉर्मली फ्रेमिंग मोड रहता है जो कि आपका बाइनरी बिट्स का कॉम्बिनेशन होता है एट द रेट 0 और 1. सो दैट्स व्हाई द पैकेट टू बी सेंट एंड द सर्विस एक्सेस पॉइंट of the layer below. So by the help of the service access point, that is SAP, all the communications can be possible, or all the communications can be done. So all the service provider is act upon the SAP, that is normally called service access point. At the receiver, the data, the indication primitive is passed of the particular corresponding layers. तो nearby और उसके जो related particular layer होता है उसके साथ वो corresponding layer के साथ communicate करेगा और pass करेगा. Then after that presenting the received packet to the V protocol utility. So all the such things are completely done by the help of certain protocol or the layer protocol concept. So that's every individual layer in a layer protocol concept or any reference model concept to coordinate with each other to to communicate the subsequent particular data. So in this particular thing, some of the common widely used components for this particular concept are, first of all, service data unit, protocol control information, protocol data unit, that is PDU, and interface control information, that is ICI, and as well as interface data unit. This section can be done on the next particular schedule of video. I hope so you watch this video, and to learn इसमें सर्विस प्रिमिटिव क्या है और सर्विस प्रिमिटिव में कितना सब्सिक्वेंट सर्विस प्रिमिटिव्स का यूज हुआ है, जैसे कि 4 अलग-अलग यूनिट लाइक सर्विस प्रिमिटिव का यूज हुआ है. And after that we can actually go to the next section. On the coming section we discuss about the subsequence, particularly commonly widely used component in this particular concept. So service primitive में क्या-क्या components यूज होता है to communicate the data. So there are 5 subsequence components widely implemented there. There is SDU, PCI, DDU, ICI and IDU. Thank you.